After the chameleon reforms of the 4th century BC, the Roman army of the 3rd century BC had gone through a drastic change since the 4th century BC. This is possibly due to the many conflicts that Rome had faced during the 4th century BC, such as the wars with the Samnites, Etruscans, Greek city-states, Italians, and Latin tribes. Because of these conflicts with their neighbors, it is highly believed that the Roman military changed by the 3rd century BC, possibly into a more practical design compared to the earlier century. In such, the military system of the Roman units in the 4th century BC had either been incorporated into new units or were outright removed entirely. An example of this is with the leves, ascensi, and rorii, in which could have been incorporated into other military units, as the leves and ascensi would have been formed and mashed together. That would make the Roman velites, while the rorii would have been incorporated into the hastati. In fact, in the 3rd century BC, the arms and armor of the Roman army changed entirely from the previous century. The Hastati, for example, were known to be a military light unit during the 4th century BC, in which typically wore no forms of armor, except for a helmet. However, all of that changed in the 3rd century BC, possibly due to the amount of wealth that Rome had acquired over the years, in which this military unit would be of the youngest soldiers of the Roman army, and would be used in the front ranks and to engage the enemy after the velites softened up the enemy. Wool tunics would actually be worn instead of the Mediterranean light tunics, possibly to add a little more protection, but it is unknown. These came in a variety of colors, as no uniform style of tunic was actually worn. Footwear would be of an everyday style design, possibly because one, this was very commonly used. This would change by the 2nd or 1st century BC. There are some accounts that the Hastati and the Principes had actually used greaves, however, could possibly only afford one, though this is very little information that we can use to go on. Typically, a leather belt would be worn as an everyday design. These are actually indicated to have had a form of design, shapes, and symbols on them, possibly sewn into the fabric, to indicate of their family and household.
Cartaginese delenda, Cartago delenda est, Cartago delenda est.
The Roman Hastati would use a style of sword called the gladius gallius during this time and century. And such, this would be the sword of the Roman military from the 4th to 2nd century BC. Pectoral chest armor would be worn as in every type of design. However, there was no uniform design. In fact, designs of even square, rectangular, oval, so it did depend on the user and his wealth. Some even could afford a backplate.
ferro flamaque minatus est, turbi ferro flamaque minatus est, aecoli me minis iuavi, aecoli me minis iuavi, ade Carthago, hic mare nostrum est, aue pater Romule, et domina abitura Marius, quod mareta flumine, usque terminos terra est.
Same as the Velites, the Roman Hastati would wear a Montefiorino design helmet. However, unlike the Velites, they would wear the Montefiorino design helmet with feather plumes sticking out from their helmet, possibly to make the soldier look taller from afar. However, there are some accounts that prove that this might have been used more to show which legion a man is part of, or as well to show the direction of each military unit.
Summus quarta decum anni legio gemina, summus quarta decum anni legio gemina, offerte deviate cedite.
The scutum was a heavy style shield. This type of design was actually used by the Roman military for centuries, possibly somewhere around the 6th to around to the 2nd or 1st century BC. However, some accounts state that this style of shield might have even been used even further, such as into the 2nd century AD, but there is very little information on that.
Cedite, milites Romani procedite.
And finally, the most infamous weapon of the Roman military at this time was the pilum. This was a gruesome style weapon. Of how the Romans acquired this weapon is little known. In fact, historians argue on how the Romans acquired the pilum, as some argue that it might have been through trade, but others argue that it might have been due to conflicts with their said neighbors, possibly with the Gauls in northern Italy.
Nostra superbia est in legione, nostra superbia est in legione, et pugans veritatus est vomus gensque, et pugans veritatus est vomus gensque, et pugans veritatus est vomus gensque, pugnans veritatus est homus gensque. Domitore scritta norum procedite